All right. Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to the podcast. I am absolutely thrilled that you are here. If you've never checked out our program before, we are primarily an interview and a commentary podcast. You can find the Billy D's podcast pretty much anywhere you find podcasts. And you can also find me on Twitter. On the studio line today, I have Carolyn Birrell. How are you doing, Carolyn?
I'm doing great, Billy. It's a pleasure to be here.
Awesome. So glad that you are here. We're going to talk about somewhat of a serious subject today, and that is going to be Alzheimer's dementia. And Carolyn here is an author of a book titled Walking with Faye, My Mother's Uncharted Path into Dementia. Carolyn retired to Bonners Ferry, Idaho in 2006 after living in Atlanta, Georgia for 20 years, where she worked for the American Cancer Society national headquarters and then as a real estate agent and new home builder. Well, that's interesting. She began caring for her aging mother shortly after her move and started chronicling her journey. What began as a written collection of her mother's difficult behaviors during dementia's earliest stages quickly turned into a comprehensive book that she continued to update until the inevitable end of her mother's disease. Now, just to give this a little bit of a backdrop, an estimated 6.2 million Americans aged 65 and older are living with Alzheimer's dementia, and this is as of 2021. The percentage of people with Alzheimer's dementia increases dramatically with age. For example, 5.3% of people aged 65 to 74, 13.8 aged 75 to 84, and 34.6. Now, just imagine that's roughly 35% of people aged 85 or older. Let's talk a little bit. I described it as Alzheimer's dementia. And a lot of people conflate those two terms. So can you clarify exactly what Alzheimer's is as opposed to dementia?
Sure. Alzheimer's is a category under the dementia umbrella. So if you picture an umbrella named dementia, underneath it are several different categories like Alzheimer's, Lewy body, Parkinson's, frontal temporal. Those are the specific diagnoses of the overall dementia diagnosis. And they can be helpful to determine from a doctor's standpoint when they're dealing with somebody with dementia.
Yes. So I guess in a nutshell, you have dementia, which is the loss, I guess, of cognitive abilities, memory, and so on. Mm-hmm. And this can be caused by Alzheimer's, which is what your mother's journey was on. But different things like Parkinson's can also cause a lot of the same things, the memory loss and other things. So dementia is kind of like a category of loss inside the brain functioning, I guess, so to speak. And Alzheimer's is a specific cause of that. Is that the best way to put it?
That's a great way to put it.
Okay, very good. Now, I was a caregiver. And one of the things that I always contrast is my mother didn't have dementia, but she did get to a point where she needed, 24 hours of care. And, my life prior to that, my mom has since passed away, but my life prior to that. And then the day that realization came upon me, that was quite a contrast. So let's talk a little bit about what your life was like prior to the difficulty that started with your mother.
I had recently moved to North Idaho from Atlanta. I had a busy real estate career there with my then husband, and we were looking for, a slower paced lifestyle. So we moved west and set up house in North Idaho, small town, 2,500 people. And very shortly after that, I started having a difficult time ignoring the changes in behaviors that my mother was exhibiting on our phone calls. We would have a morning chat. I'd have my coffee, 7 a.m. It was 10 a.m. Atlanta time. And she would just come in from her walk, and we would just have any number of conversations. And I started noticing things like the loops she was on, the loop of repeating herself every minute or so. She would just launch right back into the same story. And it was curious because it wasn't the typical kind of thing where somebody says, "Oh, did I tell you that already?" It was just a complete repeat of what she had just said. And a lot of paranoia, stories about things that were happening around her house that she was sure were happening, like somebody was coming in at night and rearranging her magazines. Somebody had paid her electric bill for her, and she was furious about it, and she couldn't figure out who it was, but the bill was paid. So those sorts of things were becoming more commonplace in our conversations together, and it was really getting harder and harder for me to rationalize them away as just mom's getting quirky.
Yeah, that's tough. I've been around people who have been on that journey. Someone very close to me, their parents, one of them has Parkinson's, and a lot of times he'll get up in the middle of the night and insist somebody is walking around the house, and that's just so difficult to deal with. Now, in your case, like so often, and in the case of, in my case, it happened in an emergency room when my mom had, gone over an area where I would say her health was clearly not going to come back. And I knew that she was going to need care. And that wave, that realization comes to you. The way I understand it in your case, I guess that wave of reality, so to speak, came the day that you got a call from the sheriff's office. So do you want to tell us a little bit about that day?
It did. I was awakened very early in the morning, Idaho time. It was still dark out, and my phone rang, and I answered it, and it was a very Southern gentleman on the other line who was nervous to talk to me, but launched right into the story of the phone calls he'd been receiving from neighbors and residents of the town, complaining about my mother's driving. She had cut someone off. She was driving erratically. She was on the wrong side of the road, and he wanted me to do something about it. And, as I was clearing my eyes and trying to focus, in the dark, I'm thinking, I'm 3,000 miles away.
Yeah.
How am I going to do this with my fiercely independent mother?
Yeah.
Who, I'm going to tell now that people have been talking about her in her town and complaining about her driving. I knew it wasn't going to go over well.
Yeah. That's tough. And I'm telling you, that can really, when you start to realize that you've essentially become the role of a parent in reverse, I think that can be very tough. At least that's how I would describe it in my case. Now, you started very early on, from what I understand, started chronicling the progress of what was going on with your mother in terms of the Alzheimer's and so on. What made you decide to start chronicling it? Was it something you did for, like, maybe to help yourself, or was your intention always to write a book of some kind?
I never intended to write a book. It started with emails mostly. I was emailing girlfriends, like, "You're not going to believe what mom did today,"
Mm-hmm.
or "I've got a funny story for you. This is what my mother did or said." And I had been saving those. Meanwhile, I had been searching for a book in our library, in our bookstore, and I was looking for something that would help me because I was drowning. I was being batted at by tennis balls from my mother, and I was dodging them left and right or trying to hit them back. And I was making all of the mistakes. I was rationalizing with her. I was telling her she was wrong. I was telling her she was imagining things, and all of these ways of responding to somebody who's convinced that these things are happening only undermine their confidence in you. And they feel like you've become the enemy. You don't believe them. You're against them. You're not supporting them. And I'm her daughter.
Yes.
So I was looking for a book that would say to me, these things might happen, this story or that story, scenarios that I could relate to and maybe learn the best way to respond, because I was getting very bad reaction from her.
Sure.
I couldn't find that book.
That's interesting, because I've heard from so many people here, again, not just limited to dementia, but a lot of times when you're a caregiver, you're the person who has to make them sit up. You're the person who has to make them get washed when they don't want to get washed. And pretty soon they begin to resent you. you're the person that's kind of telling them what to do. And I like I said, I've been there. You did eventually decide to write a book. So kind of my next question would be, what made you decide to actually turning it into a book? And did you have a background as a writer?
What happened is after I was sorting through my emails and reading some of the stories over again, and sometimes they made me laugh and sometimes they made me cry, but I was getting this stack, of them. I'd been printing them out. And somewhere in about year 3 of my 8 years with my mother, I realized I had the material for the very book that I'd been looking for and that I could help. That, this monumental disease
Yeah.
that is so impossible for people to deal with, and it catches almost everyone by surprise. We don't just ease into something like this. It's like you sort of said with the emergency room experience, it's presented to you, and we typically don't have experience in that field. So when I realized I was living the days that I was looking for, and I was making the mistakes that I wanted to read about, and then I was finding answers along the way, I could help the next person that was behind me.
Yes. And I'll tell you the lesson I learned, and here again, this kind of transcends the subject of dementia, but I can tell you, if you have aged parents or anybody that you're taking care of, the idea of a living will, the do not resuscitate, those conversations, all of those things, they can be difficult, but I'm telling you, you don't want to wait until the day that you're in an emergency room to be sorting those things out like I did. The pandemic, with COVID and everything, really impacted a lot of different things, whether it be mental health, addiction, all these things heavily, heavily impacted. And one of the sad things about people who, let's say, have been in nursing homes in general, whether they have dementia or not, was they were cut off at a very critical time in life when it's end of life. And that support can be so important. How did that impact you as you were going through that?
It hit me square in the face when I received the phone call from the facility my mother was living in. I received it at the end of March 2020. That was just when New York State closed down.
Man.
That was just when Florida became known as the hot spot, and that was where I was wintering. I had to get a flight to North Idaho, and it took me over a week of rescheduling, because every time I booked my flight, I would get a phone call from the airline saying it had been canceled and rescheduled, and then that would be canceled. So I spent a solid week just trying to get home. And by the time I did get home, I had been rerouted through Minneapolis and spent the night in the airport before I could even get to North Idaho, where they had made an exception for me to come see my mother. They had put her in her own quarantine room. It was the first time they had done this, because again, it was the end of March, and they told me that I couldn't come back to see her after I had gone the time that I had, because they were worried that I was a risk for infecting the residents there that were compromised. So in the end, what I ended up doing was refusing to come out of her room. And I stayed with her for the last 2 full days of her life. And I was lucky enough to be in the room with her when she left.
Yeah. That's great that you were able to do that. I'm going to take it that to some degree, maybe she was in and out. Did she have any awareness that you were there?
At that point, she didn't. She was, she was, her eyes were open and she was talking to herself, but she wasn't seeing anybody in the room.
Yeah. How long did this, from the time she was diagnosed until the time she passed, how many years went by, and is that reflective of what life expectancy is with that diagnosis?
My mother's was an 8-year journey.
Wow.
Since writing the book, I've heard so many people say they had 5 years, they had 10 years, some have had 15 years. So it's somewhere statistically, it's somewhere below a 20-year typical.
Yeah. That, I guess, it would a lot depend on what stage they find it, how old you are, how, it probably just depends. Yeah. Yeah. How much? Yeah. I've mentioned before caregivers. You were a caregiver. One of the things that we always talk about in regard to caregivers is self-care. And I know that self-care word gets thrown around a lot on social media and stuff like that. But when you're dealing with something like this for 24 hours a day, and if you've never been down this road, you may not have an awareness of what that can be like, but you're never really asleep. You're never really relaxed. It's just constant. There comes a time when you have to take a step back from it. And I know every instinct tells you, I got to be there. I got to be there. You never know what's going to happen, etc. There comes a point when you got to take a step back. How did that work for you? My understanding is from the last time we talked, you didn't do that so well at first. How would you manage that if you had to do it over again?
Yeah, I was just going to ask you, how did you manage it with your mother? I managed it very poorly. I did all of the things, like I ran myself into the ground. I made myself sick. I had crying bursts in the grocery store. I was terrorized every time the phone rang. There were times where I didn't want to answer the phone, yet I trip over myself trying to reach the phone because I knew that there was a strong possibility that something was happening with my mother. It was that devil and angel on your shoulder for the
Yeah.
longest time. You wanted to wipe your hands clean of it, yet you couldn't help yourself. I had to see my mother taken care of. No matter what abuse she hurled at me, I had to go see that she was safe.
Yeah. I didn't manage it well. I think I was very lucky. My wife was very supportive, and unfortunately, a lot of couples, their partner don't always do that. But I was very, very lucky. I had a very supportive wife, so that helped tremendously. Probably one of the things I would have done was I worked with hospice and a couple of organizations here in Ohio, and they would offer to take her like for the weekend, so could have a break. And I never did take advantage of that. It was just the logistics of getting her to and from and everything. I just figured it wasn't worth it. But if I had it to do over again, I probably would. I really think that you need to take a step back from it. And that doesn't mean that you're neglecting your loved one. You can't be there for them if your health crumbles. And my wife was quite frankly concerned about my stability. I could have had a heart attack or something. With not eating, not sleeping, all these other things. So yeah, absolutely. I probably could have handled it a lot better to answer your question. Now, getting back to the story of the book, and I think a lot of times I really like this type of author content in that it's a book for sure, and obviously we want you to buy the book, but I really like the fact that it ties in to something that a lot of people are experiencing. And right now, with baby boomers getting older, and that the baby boom has that word for a reason. There was an explosion of young babies there over a short period of time. Now, decades later, just the opposite is going to happen. You're going to have a lot of people getting into the area where they are going to need help. They're going to go into homes. They're going to need help from their children. This is all happening at the same time. So a lot of health providers feel that we could be entering a time of a potential crisis when we have more people to take care of than where we're going to have providers. So this book, I think, is so important because it does chronicle that. Here again, Walking with Faye, my mother's uncharted path into dementia. What do you hope that the reader takes away from the book?
I get that question asked a lot, and I think I have a different answer depending on the situation. A lot of times it's meant to help somebody not make the same mistakes I made because they're so easy to make, especially when your loved one is behaving in a way that you don't recognize. It's so out of character for them. Maybe they're being harsh to you. Maybe they're using foul language. My mother started doing that. And, that would get our mouths washed out with soap in the morning, if that happened in our household. But I also would like a reader to come away knowing that they have this one opportunity with their loved one. It's finite. They're not going to be here forever. And that's the case with everybody. But when it comes to dementia and caregiving, if there's a way to take away that taskmaster feeling that you have. Like you said, you've got to get them up in the morning. They've got to get washed. They've got to be fed. They've got to have their medication. You become this different sort of person who, after a very short period of time, doesn't enjoy their person anymore. Yeah. And we become this taskmaster who's got to get these things done and carries a little bit of resentment along with it.
Oh, sure.
You can't deny that. And if you can find a way to find a little humor in the day, maybe coerce another funny story out of them before it's too late, before their stories end, I think that it can leave the reader not feeling so regretful in the end, because you don't get a do-over. And that was what I wanted more than anything. I wanted to go back one more time and enjoy my mother one last time, because I was so busy getting her teeth brushed, fighting with her over which shirt she was going to put on that day.
Yeah. With so many people having phones today, you can make pretty decent video recordings with them and so on. One of the things that I kind of wish that I would have done before my mom became gravely ill, she was kind of a funny, she was a card. And I kind of wish I would have recorded some of those final moments. That's kind of me. You talk about regrets. Yeah, I kind of wish that there was a couple moments that, because she had some funny stories. She was a character when she was young. And I kind of wish I would have captured some of those. So I don't know. Do you think that's a good idea for if you feel right and the person's willing to participate? Is that something that you would kind of recommend doing?
Oh my God, I think that's a fantastic idea. I would have loved to have done something like that. Imagine being able to put that on. It's like your wedding video, or videos of your kids running around at summer vacation beach trips.
Yeah. Yes. So I know a lot of times I ask for a message of hope from the guests, and sometimes that can be a complicated question. Hope is one of those words that's actually very complex. It can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. And as I mentioned, we're heading into a time when a lot of baby boomers are getting into this area where they're going. Health is going to decline in some way. It may not be Alzheimer's, but it's the end of life stages that can be so complicated and so sensitive. For a lot of people who are in that boat, who have parents and just family members in general, extended family members that are going on this journey, what message of hope would you have for them? What message of strength would you have for them?
I think it would probably be surround yourself with your friends and your loved ones for support, because they want to help you. They're probably not going to know how to help you. You're going to have to help figure that out. Little things, whether it's, could you run to the store for me because I don't have time to do that today. I can't put my finger on what sorts of things, but surround yourself with people. If it's not just to talk to them and, cry on somebody's shoulder because you had a tough day that day. I think that's the best thing. Yeah.
We've been talking to Carolyn Birrell. And the author's name is spelled last name B as in boy, Irrell. The name of the book is Walking with Faye, My Mother's Uncharted Path into Dementia. What is the easiest way for people to find the book?
Amazon.com. Probably the easiest. You can go to any online provider that you use, Barnes & Noble, Target, Walmart.com. But with Amazon, it's right there at your fingertips. Most people have an account with them. And just type in Walking with Faye.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I would also add, too, that when it comes to being a caregiver, a lot of people, unfortunately, don't have good family support. A lot of times they're no longer with us. Sometimes they're just unwilling to help you. And if you don't have good friends and all of these other things, that can be a very difficult situation. Depending on what situation you are in, I can tell you, if you feel like you need help, if you feel like you need to talk to someone, there's more resources available now than there ever have been. If you are, have a loved one in hospice or any type of palliative care, end of life care, generally there's a social worker that can help you as a family member get the help you need. Don't suffer and let your mental health deteriorate You want to stay strong for yourself and you want to stay strong for your loved ones. So be sure to take care of yourself. Carolyn, I want to thank you so much for being on the podcast today. This message about dementia and Alzheimer's in particular, people are hearing about it more and more. And it's something we have to get used to talking to. I believe that there is a stigma. Before I let you go, maybe I'll ask you that one more time. Did you feel any type of stigma when you told people that your mom had Alzheimer's?
I never felt stigma when I told them, but what I felt was a lot of people questioned my judgment that she had dementia when they spoke with her. Speaking with my mother during the first 5 years, maybe 4 years of her 8 years with me, she talked a pretty good game. You'd have to spend a little bit of time with her to start hearing the repeating or the outlandish stories she was telling. But in the beginning, she was believable. So I often got the little sideways look from people like, Carolyn, I think she's okay. Are you overreacting?
Yeah. That's a good point. And a lot of times, for whatever reason, I don't know why people want to dismiss it. And that's an excellent point. If you suspect something is wrong with one of your loved ones, no matter what it is, follow your instincts and get them checked out. Carolyn, thank you so much for being on the podcast today. I really appreciate it. I'll say the name of the book one more time, Walking with Faye, My Mother's Uncharted Path into Dementia. Carolyn Birrell, thank you so much for being on the podcast today.
Thank you, Billy. It was my pleasure.
Awesome. Thank you very much as well for listening to our podcast today. Once again, you can find the Billy D's podcast. I don't know how you came across our podcast today, but you can find the Billy D's podcast again the next time, anywhere you find podcasts, whether it be Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Good Pods, Pandora, on down the line. And of course, you can find me, my social media home, being at Billy D's on Twitter. Thank you very much for listening today, and we will talk to you soon. I'm Billy Dees and host of the self-titled podcast, The Billy Dees Podcast. We are primarily an interview and a commentary-based podcast featuring authors and creators talking about their craft, advocates for community issues, and myself and an array of co-hosts discussing current events. There's no partisan ranting and raving going on here, just great content. You can find the Billy Dees Podcast on your favorite platform and on Twitter at Billy Dees. Thank you, and I hope you listen in.